If you do the grocery shopping, you may have noticed that the sky-high prices of foods have somehow soared even higher after Russia invaded Ukraine. Much of this is due to the compounding effect of first the COVID-19 pandemic and now the conflict in Ukraine. So for a food supply system that has been really pushed to the brink already over the past couple of years, how will it survive now the conflict in Ukraine? Now, you might be wondering why I chose to make a video that focuses on the conflict in Ukraine and how that impacts our food supply chain, when so many other aspects of this conflict make it a real humanitarian crisis. And the reason is that I don't have education in some of these other aspects, but I do have a doctorate in food science, so I'm going to focus on the food side of this. And like I said at the top, for the past 2 or so years, the food supply chain has already been very strained due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, last month, that would be February, the United Nations reported that food and feed prices were at an all-time high. Now, for me, and probably many of you watching this, that simply means your grocery bill is a lot higher than normal. But for other parts in the world, particularly spots that are more developing or already struggle with hunger and feeding their people, these types of changes in price mean that many people will go hungry and there will be little or no food in these areas. Right now, the biggest area of concern is the production of grains, specifically wheat. And it is predicted that the loss of just the grains from this conflict in Ukraine is going to impact people all around the world. Countries that are very far from Ukraine are predicted to go hungry and to lead to huge amounts of food insecurity due to the conflict. And this is such a big problem because Russia and Ukraine are nicknamed Europe's breadbasket, and both of them are top producers of wheat, rye, barley, potatoes, buckwheat, and maize. As of right now, the biggest concern has to be with wheat because this has already been planted in the field. So it should have been planted in fall and it would be expected to be harvested sometime in spring in the coming months. Obviously, right now, farmers don't have basic supplies to grow the wheat. They do not know if it's safe to harvest the crop once they have it. And they are expecting much lower yields because of all these factors, which means any wheat that is harvested in Ukraine is probably going to stay in Ukraine and feed the people there, feed their military. The same can probably be said for Russia. They will probably keep all their wheat, which means we are going to have a large gap in how much wheat is exported to other countries. Now, this is of great concern because Ukraine is actually the #1 wheat producer for the World Food Program, a program that is in countries all around the world trying to feed hungry people. So the areas that are actually going to be hit hardest by this gap in the grain production is areas that are already really vulnerable and struggling. So typically the export of wheat from Ukraine would go to areas in North Africa and the Middle East. And this year there may be no exports available for these regions. If we take Egypt, for example, which has become increasingly reliant on wheat exported from Russia and Ukraine, Egypt uses this wheat to make loaves of bread, and this bread is actually subsidized for about 2/3 of their population. 2/3 of their people rely on this wheat, and it only costs them about 50 cents a month, and they would receive 5 loaves of bread a day. So it's areas like these that are already struggling with food security that are most likely to be hit by this gap in grains. Moving on to a second food ingredient that is very likely to be impacted, and that is sunflower oil. And this is simply because if you add the production of sunflower oil from Russia, plus what's made in Ukraine, they actually export about 75% of the world's total supply of sunflower oil. Now, you might be thinking at least this is something we could do without, but sunflower oil is actually a very common ingredient in foods, from everything like baby food, baked goods, pre-made food, canned food. It's a very common ingredient, especially for quick service restaurants, your fast food restaurants, and I guess just restaurants in general. Places like Starbucks and McDonald's. And a lot of these establishments have been struggling with the pandemic over the past several years, trying to stay open, and now they also will have to adjust because they typically use a lot of sunflower oil in their foods. Now, the supply of sunflower oil hasn't been greatly impacted just yet, but that's because the planting season is around April or May. However, farmers are already saying there's less people to work the fields, they cannot find seeds to even plant their crops, and of course, they probably will not feel safe doing their farming. Now, the third concern I want to touch on today is more of a practical issue, but this is the fact that Russia is the #1 exporter of fertilizers. So fertilizer is something you would add to the soil when you're growing crops because it helps to provide some key nutrients to these plants as they grow, and it really increases the yield a farmer can get. So if you have just one field and you use fertilizers, you will get more crops to harvest in the end. Now, this is becoming an issue because of a couple things. Number one, companies are trying to not buy products from Russia. They don't want to buy them. Alternatively, Russia can say they're going to stop exporting fertilizers because they don't want to help these other countries grow crops. Or maybe they only have enough fertilizers to keep for themselves, which they're going to do to feed their own people. And if we take Ukraine's wheat, which is already planted, if fertilizers aren't applied around now or within a couple weeks, it's estimated that yields will be down anywhere from as little as 15% to even over half. And the same can be said for other needs like having insecticides and herbicides. These are also really critical to have the yield that farmers are used to. And even if we assume that farmers are able to get seeds and they have fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides, they have people to work the land, there is still one major issue, and that is the shortage of fuel. Because if farmers don't have gas or diesel to run their equipment, of course, anything that has been grown, any harvest is essentially doomed, and that food will go to waste. Now, there's a couple reasons there is already a fuel shortage. One of them is that natural gas prices are extremely high right now. A second is that any fuel that can make it into Ukraine is obviously going to be sent to the military, as that's the first priority, which leaves farmers in a bit of a predicament. And I even read one news story where farmers in northern Ukraine are currently skimming some fuel out of a ditch. And the reason the fuel is in the ditch is because a train was attacked and the fuel started leaking. If you are looking for a way to help, I've posted in the description a link to the World Food Program's donate page. And the World Food Program provides life-saving food to people in over 80 countries.